And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Scott Swan in the Channel 13 studios. We've got breaking news coming out of Carroll County this afternoon. We have learned there is a verdict in the Delphi murders case, and we've got a crew on the scene just outside the Delphi courthouse. Anne Marie Tiernan joins me live to tell us what you know at this hour. Anne?
Scott, Bob just stepped outside of the court. Verdict was read. We're told it took less than 2 minutes. Bob, explain the scene, everything you've learned.
So, and it was, 2 minutes. Guilty, 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 and guilty. All 4 counts against Richard Allen. Jurors came back. Obviously, it must be unanimous. The judge asked the defense team if they wanted to poll the jurors. The defense team did, so we got to hear every one of the jurors say that indeed was their verdict. Again, guilty on felony murder of Abby Williams, guilty felony murder of Libby German, guilty murder of knowingly or intentionally killing Abby, and guilty murder knowingly or intentionally killing Libby. Richard Allen sat emotionless. He did not show any emotion during the verdict as it was read. The defense counsel, specifically Andrew Baldwin, was sitting right next to him. He had his arm around Richard Allen at that time. He was rubbing the back of his head. The judge made it very clear that she wanted everyone to remain respectful, no outbursts in the courtroom, and there were not. But the families of Abby and Libby certainly were overcome with emotion. Becky Patty, that's Libby's grandmother, she was clutching her husband Mike's arm. And when the verdict came in, right in the front row, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter, he put his hands, he put his head down into his hands. He began crying. Again, it took less than 2 minutes for the main part of all of this to play out. And at the end of it, the judge thanked the jurors for their service. She thanked the attorneys for what she said was a well-argued case on both sides. Richard Allen was led away in handcuffs. And at that point, after he left the room, after the judge left the room, after the jurors left the room, that's when we really saw the emotion. That's when we saw, again, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter. He reached back and he held on tightly to Libby's grandmother's hand.
I know it's tough. You've been watching these families. It's emotional for everybody involved. The families sharing to you that when they saw some of the testimony and some of the evidence in the case and hearing the voice of a loved one that they haven't heard for 7.5 years. I mean, this has been very, very difficult. We did see outside when the news broke, Emily, quite an outburst here along the streets.
Yeah, there was a lot of cheering, guilty, guilty. You saw some people crying and rushing away. Saw a gentleman that I've seen sitting with the Allen family throughout the trial. He walked out very swiftly and very quietly, and I kind of perked up to see him, and I thought, what's that about? And then the next thing you know, here was the pool reporter coming out with all of the charges. But yeah, loud out here, people cheering.
There was a lot for this jury to consider, Bob. We were adding it up. We kind of got 19 or 20 hours of deliberations is what we think is probably a pretty close estimate to going through all that evidence, all the witness testimony, which frankly was very contradictory. And they were able to sort through that. But this resounding, we had talked about the possibility perhaps of there being a split in this verdict. Maybe the knowing and intentional would maybe not be something given the evidence that the jury thought that they would be able to say beyond a reasonable doubt, but that all proved not to be the case.
Not the case. And the jury did, I believe that obviously the confessions moved the jury. That was the most powerful evidence we saw, I think, throughout this entire verdict, and I think that was something that moved jurors in this situation, and it appears that they also believed the physical evidence that the state presented, tying Richard Allen to the scene.
That cartridge, right?
Yeah.
Cartridge. I'm curious to know what the faces of the juries? Were they stoic? Were they? Did they look at anyone?
To be honest, Emily, I was looking directly at Richard Allen, and I was trying to look at the families. We should mention a sentencing date has been set, so December 20th is when Richard Allen will be sentenced, and during the sentencing portion of the verdicts being read today, this was after the verdicts were read, but at that point, Richard Allen turned around. It was the first emotion that we saw. He looked at his wife, Kathy, and he said, "Are you okay?" Kathy was crying. Richard Allen's mother was in court. She was crying. Again, as things started to clear out, Jerry Holman, Indiana State Police detective, who has been on this case for multiple years, he went over and he hugged the defense team and he kissed Nick McLeland, the prosecutor. There were a lot of hugs on the side of the prosecution. Again, after the families were starting to leave, we were asked to stay in the courtroom to give the families a chance to file out. The families went up to the prosecution team, shook hands, hugged as well. So a lot of emotion. Again, everyone kind of kept things in check while the jury was in there, while the judge was in there afterward. That's when we saw the emotion really starting to let out.
This is the day, Emily, and
Today
we've
is the
heard
day.
the family say this is the day many, many times, but now finally this is the day for justice for the families of Libby and Abby.
Yeah, I can hear them saying it. Today is the day. They would say it so many times over the years, and to be here in this moment, I have goosebumps considering it and thinking today is the day for them. Today is the day for Abby and Libby and their families, the people that love them.
There's no doubt that this legally was, in many ways, if you looked at outside observers, says there's just a circus going on there. I mean, there was just no love lost between the defense and the prosecution and the judge in this case. Often after we hear a verdict, then we hear, well, there will be an appeal. Any word, any talk about that? Walk us through those steps as we count down to sentencing, where at last report I had read that Richard Allen could get up to 130 years in prison if convicted of all the charges. Is that consistent with what you've been finding?
Well, if I remember correctly, I think it's 46 years on the main counts, and whether those are going to be concurrent, whether those are going to be consecutive, there will be a pre-sentence report that will be filed that the judge will consider at the sentencing hearing. The judge will hear from both the prosecutor and from the defense to try to mitigate as far as either how lengthy or how short the sentence will be. So again, the judge is the one who's going to decide what the sentence is going to be. And to your point regarding an appeal, we pretty much, that's almost a certainty. There was certainly a lot of evidence that the defense wanted to enter into this case that they were not allowed to, that Judge Gall told them that she did not think that they had enough of a link between some of the things that they wanted to bring in and the actual crime. So the defense most certainly will be filing an appeal in this case, and it will go to the Indiana Court of Appeals.
And Bob, would they file that after he is sentenced?
It's a good question. I don't know that. I'll be interested to hear that from Katie Jackson-Lindsay
Right.
as far as the timing of how all that plays out. But I believe it probably would take place after the sentence.
Because listen, there was a handful of people that this defense team believed in their alternate theory was responsible in this crime, and they wanted to be able to talk about that to the jury. Again, as you said, Judge Gall ruled no, that's not going to happen, that would confuse the jury, and we're going to stick with these set of facts right here, and that's what they did.
Richard Allen was arrested and has been in custody since October of 2022, so 2 years served. Part of the testimony in this case is that was a very difficult time, especially when he was in solitary confinement. Having a mental breakdown was part of the argument, even part of the testimony that we're trying to determine whether or not he had developed some sort of psychosis. So that's another thing that will be taken into consideration in the sentencing as well for those 2 years since he's been here in custody, state custody, since 2022.
Yeah, all those things will be a factor, and there are multiple items that the defense will want to bring up on appeal, whether they were allowed to enter certain things that the judge did not allow them to, witnesses that they wanted to bring, evidence that they wanted to show the jury that they were not able to. So, and even the procedural moves that happened long ago, dating back here over the last year in this case, things that Judge Gall ruled on, those will all be brought up, and all of those things were preserved on the record by the defense team so that when this case does go to the Court of Appeals, those will be considered. But again, today, guilty. That is the verdict. That is, these 12 jurors who spent the last nearly month of their lives looking at all the evidence, looking at all the testimony. Decisive decision from these jurors today. They say Richard Allen is guilty of killing Abby Williams and Libby German.
And we have not been able to talk with that panel, and that we may never hear from them, or we may. I mean, it depends if they want to talk about what those deliberations were like, what were key points of evidence, was it the confession, was it the cartridge, what was it that led them to have this unanimous decision beyond a reasonable doubt.
I mean, when you think about those confessions, Bob, that we heard, him, at least the ones that they played in court, in those confessions, I mean, he sounded fairly logical, no?
He did. The one confession that stands out in my mind the most was on a call to his mother, Janice, and he said, did Kathy, my wife, tell you that I confessed? And she said, yeah, we're not going to talk about that. You didn't do it. They're messing with your mind. He said, no, I did it. And she said, no, honey, I can't. I know you don't have it in you to do something like that. And his response was, Mom, I wouldn't sit here and tell you I did it if I didn't do it. And that really stood out to me. So ultimately, then it comes down for the jurors to figure out, do they believe the state's witnesses that he was, thinking clearly at that time, or that he was in a state of psychosis? These jurors believed at this point, they believed the prosecutor. They believed the state saying Richard Allen was in his right mind when he made those statements. And, a lot of times you hear when someone says something, believe them. And in this situation, the jury believed Richard Allen when he said, I killed Abby and Libby.
Wow, what a tough day. What a tough day, but maybe also relief for this community. This has been a journey that they unwittingly were a part of. They didn't want to have this thrust upon their community, the fear, the search that there might be a killer living amongst them, the way that they changed and navigated their lives because of the thought that their children would not be safe to go out and walk along the streets, along the High Bridge Trail, along to be out in nature when they're being unsupervised. That has changed this community here in Carroll County, and now today, perhaps they can put this chapter to rest and move forward.
Very first day of testimony, we heard a witness, Sarah Carbaugh, who says that she saw a bridge guy walking along the side of the road on the day of the murders, and she told the jury, she said, this crime, the events that happened on February 13th, 2017, she said it has turned this town and everyone in it upside down. And that we certainly know to be a true statement. Folks I've talked to here over the last several weeks have said that Delphi has never been the same. And they were very much looking for and hoping for some type of resolution, some type of healing. Today's the day that the verdict came down, and we will see if now that starts to happen.
17 days of testimony, 64 witnesses, 387 exhibits, 7.5 years since the murder, 2 years since Richard Allen was arrested, 21 days since opening statements, and 4 days of deliberations that lasted approximately 19 to 20 hours. And now we have a verdict, guilty of all counts against Richard Allen. That's the very latest from here. We're going to send it back to you, Scott.
Anne Marie and Bob Siegel in Delphi, and they're going to be standing by waiting to see if we might be able to talk to either the prosecutors in the case or the defense team, if the jury may be willing to speak. If that happens, we'll bring that to you. And certainly if we hear from either family of these two young girls who died 7.5 years ago, we will bring that to you as well. I want to bring into our conversation Katie Jackson Lindsay, who's been the 13 News legal analyst throughout these 19 or 20 days worth of coverage of the Delphi murders trial. She's been with us every night on the Delphi debrief. What's your reaction to Richard Allen being found guilty on all 4 charges?
As a defense attorney, I'm surprised, but you can never really be surprised by a verdict. In this case, we weren't allowed in the courtroom, and so it's hard to get a real feel for the evidence and the impact that it was having. But this jury did their job. They worked hard for hours, for 4 days of deliberations. They asked questions, and that is the verdict that they reached. So I'm surprised based on what I understand the burden of proof to be, but we have to trust them. We have to trust our system.
Let's go back and, for those of you who have been following this trial and maybe those of you who have not, let's go back to the state's, evidence that they began putting on. A couple of their early witnesses were describing Bridge Guy, the guy that we've all seen on the video, but describing a much younger man, describing a man in his 20s, a tall, muscular man with brown, poofy hair. That wasn't 40-year-old Richard Allen at that point. And so, there were the thoughts that maybe the witnesses had the wrong person, or that they were describing someone that was quite different than Richard Allen.
Agreed, and that was the first evidence that we heard, right? That we heard as the public, that the jury heard, that there was this youthful man with boyish, youthful looks, with longer hair. And we as the public, not the jury, but as the public, we also were aware of those sketches that were created as a result of this witness testimony, or these witnesses giving these statements to the police. And we knew that wasn't Richard Allen. And so that was the first impression of the state's evidence. And as it went on even longer, it seemed to be more of that, where they had evidence that could be Richard Allen, but could also leave room for reasonable doubt. But I think ultimately what got them over the finish line, and rightfully so, was those confessions. We've said over and over and over, it's hard to convince a jury that your client didn't do something as a defense attorney if your client has said repeatedly that he did, and emphatically in the way that Bob described, especially with the call with his mother. So I think that's probably what got the jury there, and you can understand how they could reach that conclusion with those confessions. And
remember, as this case was beginning and the state was presenting the case, the jury was hearing these emotional confessions that Richard Allen was making from prison. He did talk to his mother, he did talk to his wife, and each time would say, I did it. Now, there was one recording where he said, I did it, I think I did it, I don't know if I did it. And then, of course, there was a lot of testimony brought in during the trial where psychologists were brought in that had been talking to Richard Allen in prison during the time that he was awaiting this trial to start. And there was a lot of testimony that he was going through a mental health breakdown, that he was going through, various problems while he was being held for 13 months in solitary confinement. But at the end of the day, as you mentioned, maybe the confessions were the very thing that the jury said, no, that's the guy.
Right, and I mean, that is very strong evidence. Having been a deputy prosecutor myself, if you have a case with a confession, you almost consider that case a slam dunk. I don't think the prosecution took for granted that there are other evidence that was a challenge and considered that a slam dunk, but obviously they put that together very well and presented it in a way that it was compelling to the jury. And so I think if we were able to talk to that jury, we would learn that that is what took them over the edge towards guilty.
All right, let's talk about what they called the magic bullet. Okay, I guess we've got some new information from Anne-Marie Tiernan. So let's go back outside the Delphi courthouse. Anne-Marie, what have you got?
Scott, I'm here with Emily, who was just on the other side of the courthouse where state police and some family members came out and made some comments. And she joins us now with, first of all, what state police said, and then let's talk about the family.
Yeah, state police saying at this point they're not going to make any comment because Judge Gall has not lifted the gag order on this case. They said that they will be making statements next month after sentencing, but for right now, they don't have anything to say because that gag order is still in place.
And then Richard Allen's wife came out.
Richard Richard Allen's wife, Kathy Allen, came out. She was crying, and she just said to the media, "This isn't over at all." That was her one indication. And then we had a close family friend of, I believe, Libby German coming out, and she was talking about pushing for legislation to prohibit crime scene photos from being released online behind some kind of paywall, from being able to pay to see graphic crime scene photos. And as you know, it was in the past week that we had seen someone somehow had leaked photos of the girls at the crime scene, and just terrible photos. And so the families want to work on some kind of law to prohibit this from happening, because that just added to the tragedy of this, I think, for them to see their children out there in the public forum like that, and to think that someone was paying to see such a gruesome scene. They want something done about it, so that no other families have to go through that. So
yes, certainly very vulnerable pictures, and just only adding to the pain that the families have had to experience and endure. Any sense from police? Did a sense of state police feeling vindicated, or were they very stoic?
Stoic. They did not say. I mean, a spokesperson came out and said, this is going to be real short. We don't have much to say. Judge Gall has not lifted the gag order, but we're going to be happy to comment. We'll put something together next month after sentencing. And that was it.
So Bob and I were continuing to talk about what his observations were in the courtroom, and you were able to walk around the courthouse and get a little bit of a sense of what the scene is right now. What were you able to observe?
Well, interesting, as I was going over to that gathering over there, a woman was holding up a sign that said, the only crime here is the crime from police and the prosecution and, the state. So, so there are some people that think that this was the wrong decision, and they're vocal about that and holding up their signs. But I would say the majority of folks here very pleased.
Yes, Samantha Johnson is also here, and she's been talking and getting some community reaction and joins us now. Sam, what have you been able to learn from the people that you've talked to?
Well, Anne Marie, I'm currently at the location Emily was just at a few moments ago. We've heard from several community members. We heard from state police, as Emily mentioned too. I want to tell you too, so many of the people who are here waiting for this verdict have been here for weeks. So many of them have been camped out day and night to be one of the first to hear the verdict. We talked to a woman, her name is Sarah. She lives here in Delphi. She says she's a family friend of the girls, and she told us today is the day, right? That phrase, we've continued to hear that for years now. And we talked to her just a moment ago. She said she could have almost bust with excitement because she said today is finally the day. Take a listen. You said, I've been praying.
I have been praying. I said, as you know, we usually had 4 or 5 of us, just a few signs to show respect to the girls and what this community has went through for the past 7.5 years. Today is a new day. Today is that day. The day they can start healing. Today's that day that those families can start the healing process. This part is done. So as a community, now they get to heal all together. This community and the surrounding communities and counties surrounded them. Also, big shout out to law enforcement. They came from everywhere around Indiana. You couldn't tell what department, but they were so cohesive together. They blended well. You didn't see the division in the rank or anything. They protected this county, and now this county needs to heal.
Now, as we know, there are obviously two sides to this case. And like Emily mentioned a second ago, we saw Richard Allen's family walk right through these doors, one of them hand in hand with defense attorney Brad Rosie, Andrew Baldwin, Jennifer Auger, also walking out with Richard Allen's family. His mom crying, his wife Kathy crying. And then as she passed us, she said, this isn't over at all. Of course, much more to come here in Delphi. Anne Marie and Emily, we're going to stay on this side. We expect that more people may be coming out of the courthouse still. We'll check in with you in just a few minutes.
Sam, thanks so much. We're rejoined here by Bob Siegel, who just had a conversation with Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter. What did you learn from that conversation?
Well, again, there's still a gag order, so there's nothing official. There's nothing on the record. Probably the most that I can say as far as his reaction today is the reaction that he showed in the courtroom. Just out here on the steps right now, he was walking with his wife. And when I said, "Mr. Superintendent, how are you?" He just took a big, deep breath. Could tell, you know, he's taken this case very personally and been very personally involved over the last 7.5 years. In the courtroom, he and his wife, their hands were clutched. I saw when the verdict was read, he squeezed her hand a little bit tighter. She squeezed his hand back. A few moments later, he put his head down in his hands and he started crying. After the verdict, he reached back and, you know, he squeezed the hand of Becky Patty, Libby's grandmother. He went up, gave hugs to the prosecutors and the entire prosecution team. There's been countless hours put in by state police and the investigators who, not just over the last 2 years since the arrest, but obviously for the 5.5 years even before that, from the day that these girls' bodies were found, that have been working tirelessly on this case. So for Indiana State Police and the investigators who've worked on this case, obviously, I don't know if victory is the correct word today because nothing is going to bring back Abby and Libby, but as far as justice, this was the verdict they were looking for, and these were the words that they hoped Judge Gall would read after the jury came back this afternoon.
It was such a heinous crime. These girls were just in the 8th grade, and this heinous crime in this very rural, seemingly safe environment, that they went missing and then that they had been so brutally murdered. That's why this has gotten so much attention, not only in this state, in this country, but around the world. People following this case.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it so many times before. Before this happened, this was that quaint little bedroom community where people really slept with their doors open, and they talked about that to us in those early days after the girls' bodies were discovered. And after that, things really changed. And when you would come here years later to do different follow-up stories before there had been a break in the case or an arrest, if you talked to the young people that had gone to school with Abby and Libby, they would tell you how their lives had changed, that their parents were less willing to just kind of let them go for a walk in the woods. And I was just kind of looking at the day today and the blue sky and the temperature, and I remember it being like that on February 13th. February 14th, the next day, very different. It was dark, it was freezing. When you're talking about Doug Carter and his involvement, I remember him coming in on the state police helicopter and getting out to give the press conference and talk about that. It landed in a field right across from the Mears entrance where the girls had got dropped off that day. And so, and you know, when every time there was an update and a press conference, you would see Doug Carter come out and address, the media and the public when they released that second sketch. Him, saying, "I remember," and this made everyone's the hair on their arms stand up when he looked in the camera and said, "We believe you might be in this room hiding in plain sight. We believe you are in this community hiding in plain sight. You might even be in this room." And I remember that day, everyone kind of looked around at each other. So to hear Doug Carter, to hear his reaction in that courtroom, that tracks.
And I think it's one of the interesting things to point out here that was emphasized by prosecutor Nick McLeland during closing arguments is they had obviously very important video of Bridge Guy that Libby German had captured on her phone. They had folks who placed Bridge Guy along the trails and on the bridge on the day of the murders. And they had a single cartridge at the crime scene that matched, the state said, cycled through Richard Allen's gun after they went back and they re-interviewed him years later because they had remembered that he had said he was out at the scene that day. But that was it. And Nick McLeland told the jury that was all we were going to have to present to you until Richard Allen went to prison to await his trial and made confession after confession after confession. And one has to wonder today, if it were not for those confessions, would this jury have come back with the same result?
That confession to his psychologist, Dr. Monica Walla, talking about that, according to her, that when he was talking to her and confessing to her, he had said he had, taken the girls off the bridge and had just planned to rape them, and then he got scared off by a van and took them then across the creek and killed them. And it was that van detail that investigators said was only a detail that the killer would know. So, and then of course they, talked to a man, Brad Weber, that lives in that area, that drives a van, who testified, at least during the trial, that he did drive home. He did come home from work that day. He was driving a van, and it would have fit the timeline of when, the state police say that bridge guy had taken the girls off the bridge. So that van, I think, was a key part, wouldn't you say?
I would love to be
know.
inside the minds of those jurors. They listened to so much testimony. They reviewed so many exhibits. They got so much information, contradictory information from both sides. And it is possible. That we will have a chance to talk to some of the jurors later. But I would imagine many of them, if not most of them, if not all of them, would very much like to go back to their lives at this point. This has been a really long haul, 26 days sequestered away from their families and their communities. So we may not know exactly what the tipping point was for these jurors, but it was unanimous, obviously, today.
And one of the things that made this so hard on this community were those composite sketches that went out after we saw the video of the bridge guy and the audio down the hill. That those composite sketch, as it was described to me, was compared with every man that lives in this community. Right. Every man that lives in this county was compared to those composite that composite sketch. And what pressure, what kind of microscope that must have been like to be a man of those general characteristics living in this community during that time.
And not just one composite sketch, two composite sketches a few years apart. And interestingly enough, when it was all said and done for the trial, those composite sketches were not allowed in. The jury never saw those sketches. But those sketches, some of them are still hanging up in this community today. We saw a flyer on our way back from lunch, and there was composite sketch number 2. Was what it ended up, but they would say that this is the same person. Maybe, just they have similar features, but it was hard to, when you looked at them, it didn't seem, at least to my eye anyway, they didn't seem similar. But yeah, the jury never saw those sketches.
Okay, we are getting some direction that I wasn't able to hear. Could you say it again, Ashley? Okay, I don't know. Okay, I understand. Samantha Johnson is on the other side of the courthouse and is standing by with some family members. Let's go over there and see, Sam, what have you been able to learn?
Well, Anne Marie and Emily, just a few moments ago when that verdict was read, the families of the 2 girls came out right here on the sidewalk underneath the flag. They hugged, they were crying, we saw smiling happen, even obviously a flood of emotions you have to imagine. And like we mentioned earlier, they had been staying in a business just across the street here for days now as this entire community waited for a verdict. I just saw Becky Patty, the grandmother of Libby German, who has been such a spokesperson. She's been at all the hearings for this case. She hugged a family member at that door. She was smiling, she was laughing. Just a moment ago, they walked inside, they gathered their items, and they left, which to me says we've waited, and again, that phrase, today is the day for them. That sign to me showed that, okay, we have waited as long as we could, we've got the verdict, our job here is done. So Anne Marie and Emily, of course, we expect more from families. It's important to note, like we mentioned, that gag order still in place, so they won't talk to you necessarily, but you have to imagine those emotions will continue to come in the days to come. So we'll keep an eye on things here. We'll send it back to you for now.
All right, Samantha, I'll go ahead and take it back for now. We'll get out to Anne Marie, Bob, and Emily, and yourself if you have any other new information that we can share on our ongoing coverage of this verdict that has come in about 20 minutes ago in Delphi, that Richard Allen has been found guilty on all 4 counts, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of murder in the deaths back in 2017 of these 2 young girls. Libby German was just 14 and Abby Williams was just 13. we always want to remind our viewers, this is always about these two young girls. It's about their families, the loss that they have suffered for the last 7.5 years. And while there is justice for these families today, there can never be any closure because their girls are never coming back. And our hearts continue to break, and a lot of prayers are being said tonight for these two young families, Libby German and Abby Williams. Let's bring our legal analyst back in, Katie Jackson-Lindsay, again joining us. She's a former deputy prosecutor and a current criminal defense attorney. She's been with us every day of this particular trial. So I mentioned the 4 counts that Richard Allen has been found guilty of: felony murder and murder. So total of 4 counts. Tell our viewers again why he was charged for felony murder and murder in the deaths of 2 girls here.
Well, there's a felony murder count per young lady, as well as a knowing and intentional murder count per young lady. So that's why there's 4, despite there only being 2 victims. And so the difference between the two is there's knowing and intentional murder. And knowing and intentional murder is just that. Their theory under those charges is that Richard Allen knowingly and intentionally killed these girls without any not having to find any particular reason. Indiana's not a state where they have to prove motive. They just have to prove that it was knowing and intentional. On the other hand, felony murder is where the state's theory is that a person committed some other felony, and during the course of committing that felony, the girls died. So in this case, the state's theory was that even if the jury believed that Richard Allen was only responsible for kidnapping the girls, and the jury believed that that kidnapping resulted in their death, then that's enough to find him guilty of felony murder. So they agreed with each of those theories. They agreed that it was knowing and intentional, and they also agreed with the state that as a result of that kidnapping, Richard Allen was responsible for that kidnapping, and as a result of that kidnapping, each of those girls died.
We heard our crew there in Carroll County tell us that the sentencing date for Richard Allen will take place in 1 month, on December 20th. And we want to kind of get your feeling on whether or not the sentencing will be served consecutively or served concurrently. What is your expectation, and what are the ranges in terms of the sentencing?
So it gets a little bit complicated, but just as a basic understanding, each of the 4 counts carries a penalty range of 45 to 65 years. Okay, so that's just understanding the range for each. There's not a difference in the penalty range for murder versus felony murder. And then again, there's 1 set of charges for Abby, and there's 1 set of charges for Libby. So in determining whether to run those counts concurrently or consecutively, the judge has to consider a number of things, a number of factors related to the facts. I think in terms of just the 2 sets of charges in general, I think we can expect consecutive sentences. If you think about it just purely from a fairness standpoint, these were 2 separate lives that were lost. These were 2 separate girls that were died, and they do not deserve to have these sentences to be merged. And I think the judge will likely see it that way. So whether she decides to give the minimum of 45 per young lady or the maximum of 65 per young lady, I think that we'll see that they will be consecutive sentences. Now, where it gets a little bit complicated is that those 4 charges, he can't necessarily be sentenced separately on each of the 4 charges because they would have to merge together so that there's not double jeopardy. So he's not being convicted twice for the same conduct, or not convicted twice, but sentenced twice for the same conduct. So we won't see a scenario where he gets 45 to 65 times 4. It would be 45 to 65 times 2 in either case.
All right, we'll get back to Katie and get more legal analysis coming up, but we want to take you back outside the Delphi courthouse and see and talk again with Anne Marie Tiernan and Emily Longnecker.
Scott, I'm also here with Bob Siegel, who was in the courtroom when that verdict was read. We were talking about the family, the defense team. I mean, what were their movements as they were coming in, waiting to determine what was the panel's decision?
Yeah, it was about a half an hour from the time that that the media was invited into the courtroom. Richard Allen was already in the courtroom at the time, so was the entire prosecution team. Andrew Baldwin was there with his hand on the shoulder. of Richard Allen, trying to comfort him. The families were there of Abby and Libby. It was not until actually after the judge came back into the courtroom that we saw Richard Allen's family come in. And actually, Judge Gall was pretty frustrated. She wanted everybody right there. And she said, all right, we're back on the record. Where is Mr. Rosie? Andrew Baldwin said he's downstairs with the family. She said, let's get him up here right away. And as soon as they came into the courtroom, that's when the jury was asked to come in. And again, it was so fast. Literally, I don't think the jury was actually in the courtroom for more than 3 minutes total. And the judge immediately, as soon as the jury was seated, do you have a verdict?
Count one.
Foreman said yes. All right, we're going to read this. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. 3, 4, guilty, guilty. Polled all the jurors to make sure that was in fact their verdict. She said, thank you very much. The jury was excused. And again, 3 minutes, it was extremely fast.
And now, presumably traveling, getting their items from where they've been sequestered at a hotel and moving back home to Allen County after having nearly a month-long service for this trial.
Yeah, and Emily, you know from being in there almost every day as well, that usually while we're waiting for things to kind of get going, there's a lot of talking and chit-chat in the courtroom. Today,
Not today, but
there was not a single word that was uttered. The families, the attorneys, the reporters, the 30 minutes leading up to, during, and after, it was not until the judge left. But there, you could hear a pin drop in that courtroom.
I felt like you could hear a pin drop the day of those closing arguments. When those closing arguments ended and the state had that rebuttal, talking about, think of this, Libby had told her grandmother that one day she wanted to grow up and help police solve crimes, and she did that this time, and she brought her friend Abby to help her. And I remember that afternoon, it was very, very silent. Usually people would leave the courtroom kind of talking, and no one had anything to say that day either. So I thought that was a day as well. But obviously today, I can see where no one would.
Yeah,
I mean, just processing everything that had just happened, right?
Very, very solemn. After the verdict was read, the families got to leave first if they wanted to. Immediately, defense attorney Jennifer Auger went over to the Allen family. I saw Kathy Allen's head buried in Miss Auger's shoulder as she was crying and the family was crying. They were trying to comfort the Allen family. And on the other side of the aisle, on the other side of the courtroom, obviously much different emotions. It was a moment, I think, perhaps one of the first moments of celebration that you could see relief and celebration on the faces of Abby and Libby's family. And don't get me wrong here. I mean, it has been hard for these families to find anything to celebrate after this horrific ordeal that started 7.5 years ago. But this was the verdict, this was the day, this was the moment, these were the words they were waiting to hear, and today those words came.
That family, both of those families, I mean, they, over the years have done things to try and honor the girls. They built that beautiful softball park. Both the girls love to play softball. They built that with their faces up there. They've held food drives every year at the holidays to come and donate food in the girls' memories. So they have done what they could to honor their children's memories in the best way they could, under very difficult circumstances, not, all those years not knowing, not having a suspect, then a break in the case, but then waiting for the trial. And so, again, here we are. We keep saying it. Today is the day.
Well, I think it is interesting that you bring up that park, because we did go out and visit that park really on the first day of the trial here. And you really do get a sense of how many people came together to contribute time and resources to create this 25-acre facility, an amphitheater, and bricks with personal messages to the girls from the families, people saying prayers, the girls' pictures there. The day that we were there happened to be a day very similar to today, perhaps less windy, but young families out there on the swings, on the slides, having a place to come together. And it was pointed out to me that, you know, once that we've built this park in their honor, the work continues. I mean, there's still maintenance, and you still need to go out there, and that has in a way been some healing for the people that have donated their time and resources, that when they go out there and they help clean it up and help maintain that park, that they are honoring Abby and Libby and making sure that there is a place that represents their love of music, their love of nature, etc.
You know, those girls, they would be 20 now. They would be 20, you know, likely in college, young adult women, you know, getting ready to live their lives. And so they're over the years talking with the families during different key moments, different milestones of, you know, what would have been the year they would go to the prom and the year that they would have graduated. And, you know, those families watching, you know, other families, their children's friends
have
milestones, reach those milestones. And, you know, so for them to be able to have fundraisers and things to remember their daughters and their granddaughters and build that park so that other children could come and enjoy, you know, in Abby and Libby's memory.
Yeah, looking for the silver lining for sure when a very devastating, traumatic crime and case that has really gripped this community for 7.5 years. So that's the latest here from Delphi. Scott, we'll send it back to you. We have Samantha Johnson here, and she's on the other side of the courthouse, and she has some information now. Sam?
Well, Anne-Marie, we have heard from time and time again throughout this entire trial the presence of the girls, right? Abby and Libby, we can see it on the buildings, the ribbons here around us, the blue and purple ribbons representing the girls' favorite colors. And when that verdict was announced just a few minutes ago, these sidewalks were filled with people who were crying. Some of them were cheering out of excitement. They called it justice for these two girls' families. We heard from one gentleman, his name is Tim Harper. He lives here in Delphi. He was very vocal the moments after that verdict came down. Listen to what he had to say.
Tonight we'll be able to go to sleep knowing that we're all safe again, knowing that we can ask and look at one another again in the hands of love and help. The man is now going to be put behind bars for what he has done. And I believe that he is remorseful, but we don't want the remorse. We want justice, and today was the day, and we thank the Lord for everything and all of our officers and our hard duties and work. Everyone has put so much effort into this. The love and care that everybody has showed right now, loving one another and the care of not even protecting him. He's not the victim. They were the victims. And we were victims also with it. We want to be released just as well as Abby and Libby. They're free now. They are free. And again, today is their day, and we've been saying it for years. Endless nights of sleep, we can now say that this is justice, finally.
So much emotion here outside the Carroll County Courthouse. I can tell you within really the last few minutes, it's really started to quiet down. A lot of people, like we mentioned, just here to see and witness that verdict, and then now they've kind of left the downtown Delphi area. But Scott, this is really just the beginning of what we saw today, what we heard today, and of course there's much more to get to tonight on 13 News.
All right, Samantha Johnson continuing our live team coverage in Carroll County outside the Delphi Courthouse. Thanks, we'll get back to you, and we'll also get back to our crew, including Emily Longnecker, Bob Siegel, and Anne-Marie Tiernan, who are going to be covering this trial throughout the evening. If you're just joining us here on WTHR and across our social media platforms, Richard Allen was found guilty by a jury of his peers today of the murders of these two young girls 7.5 years ago, Abby Williams and Libby German, who were killed after going out for a walk. This 14 and 13-year-old girl, we always bring it back to the fact that this was all about these two young teenagers, Abby and Libby. And what a hero Libby was by having the presence of mind while she was on that Monon Bridge to bring out her cell phone and to start recording this person that was walking across the bridge that was making these two girls nervous. And the fact that these girls were able to preserve that evidence for these detectives and investigators to find the person that today was found guilty is just really something. And I must also say that I'm certainly hopeful that the jurors in this case and the families are going to be seeking help because of what they saw during this trial. And I want to bring in our legal analyst again, Katie Jackson-Lindsay, because, Katie, the reason I bring this up is that during this trial, the jurors and the family saw these gruesome photos, very difficult, on a very large monitor. And, you know, as our crew had described in the early days of this, these are images that are impossible to unsee. Absolutely. And so what do you do with jurors and families that have now, you know, seen this for the first time, or maybe this is, you know, the second or third time that families have seen that? That has got to be just so devastating for anybody to see.
For sure, absolutely. Having done this work for a long time, those are not things that you can unsee. There are things that I've carried with me into my career as a defense attorney from when I worked on child abuse cases as a deputy prosecutor, and it is extremely difficult. In terms of the family, the wonderful thing is that there are resources within our state for families who have been victims of violent crime. I have no doubt that this prosecutor's office has connected them with an advocate. And believe it or not, a lot of the times the families say they would have gotten warning that these photos were going to be shown and when, right? And they say, I need to be in that moment. I need to be in that courtroom. I need to see the photos. And that's a part of their healing journey. But you can unsee it once you see it, right? And so there are resources for them throughout the state of Indiana. There are resources for them that should be available in their local prosecutor's office. It gets a little more difficult with the jury because we have these individuals that come in and they sacrifice a month of their life to serve justice. And they did that today, but now they have to go out and they have to deal with that. And there aren't resources that are directly available to jurors. They aren't sent away with a pamphlet or a 1-800 number that they can call in order to cope with the aftermath of having even to reach this difficult decision, right? And so that's maybe a flaw or a challenge in our system, and maybe this case in particular will shed some light on that issue. So I would hope that they have the necessary resources. And I would hope that if they did happen to reach out to any of the parties involved with this case, that they are able to at least point them in the right direction in terms of coping with the aftermath of the heaviness of this case.
One of the stories that we'll be pursuing, of course, is talking with these jurors, if in fact they ever want to talk, about what they saw and what were the tipping points, if you will, in finding Richard Allen guilty on all 4 of these counts. Katie and I have been talking over the last hour or so about the confessions that Richard Allen made while he was in prison, and perhaps wondering, were those confessions that he made to the warden and to the psychologist and to his wife and to his mother, were these the things that, that really brought the jury over to say, no, this guy is guilty of doing this? Or was it something else? Because there were other pieces of evidence, Katie, along the way that the state brought up and that the defense brought up that made it made everybody kind of wonder, is this the guy? Because remember, they didn't have any DNA evidence of Richard Allen at the crime scene. No DNA evidence at all. They did have the one, you know, the bullet that was, according to the state, was cycled through a gun that was discovered at Richard Allen's home. And then investigators, you know, they came out and said, look, there was no DNA of the girls on anything that was found in Richard Allen's home. And so maybe there were times where the jury was wondering, is this man innocent or guilty? So I was just wondering about your thoughts on some of the other pieces of evidence that we saw along the way.
Sure, and you know, we talked about throughout our analysis of this case throughout the trial that a lot of those things just simply work both ways. There was no DNA evidence related to Richard Allen out there at that crime scene, but there was no DNA evidence related to any other unknown male that couldn't be identified. We had the one piece of evidence that had DNA from an unknown unknown male, but that turned out to be another forensic analyst that worked in the crime lab because there was some cross-contamination. So again, it's one of those things that works both ways, and you have to be mindful of that as a trial attorney on either side. You know, it would not have done, I don't think, and I'm sure the defense did argue this, but they couldn't shout to the rooftops that Richard Allen's DNA wasn't there because no one's DNA was there, right? And so to some extent, that was a wash. Now, what they did challenge, and I thought effectively, was the science behind the bullet. Again, that is science that is not extremely reliable because the analysts compared apples to oranges, as the defense expert said, as it related to comparing a spent bullet to a bullet that had never been fired. And so it seems ultimately the jury absolutely weighed all the evidence because they were out for a long time. This wasn't a verdict that came in on Thursday. It didn't come in on Friday. It didn't come in on Saturday. And so they really took their time. And so you have to assume that tipping point had to be those confessions,
Right.
which is really hard to wrap your mind around when you think about the fact that they didn't even have those confessions when they charged Richard Allen. So, but for those confessions, where would we be today, right? But I think ultimately that was the compelling evidence because all of those other things combined, the eyewitness testimony, the lack of DNA, the inconsistent science related, or the inconsistent opinions about the science related to the bullet, it's hard to believe that's what got the jury there, but maybe we'll get to talk to them and find out.
Right, and those digital forensics on the phone.
Right.
Remember, because someone put something in the headphone for several hours, and then of course that stopped, and that led a lot of people to wonder what happened, or was there somebody else there? So
Sure,
anyway,
and that was a bombshell for the defense when they dropped that at the end of their case.
All right, we'll hear more from Katie in a moment. Let's get back out to Anne Marie.
All right, Scott, you know, we do have a lot of questions about what was the jury thinking, how is the family feeling, what do investigators think, and the fact of the matter is that the gag order that was put in place for this case for people that are closely connected to the case, the investigators and the family, is 2 years in the making now and was to be lifted at the judge's discretion. We heard from the judge today that will remain in place until the sentencing, that now is not till December 20th. Now, we did talk with State Police Captain Ron Galavez about no comment and this gag order, and let's hear what he has to say, and then we're going to go to Bob and Emily for a little bit more context about what they can't talk about, but there are some things that they can. So here's Captain Galavez first.
Judge Gall has not lifted the gag order, so we're not going to be able to make any type of public statement at this point. We'll be looking forward to having something scheduled a month from now following sentencing. So with that, that's all that we're going to be able to say at this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. You can't talk about it. All right, so pretty tight-lit there from State Police. And we're just having this discussion of like, what can they and can they not talk about? Because we have seen, let's talk about the family, that they have gone on social media and they have made comments, not specifically about the evidence, not specifically about what's going on in court, but about perhaps their feelings and their sense of loss or their sense of hope. And so we've been hearing tidbits like that, but you know, so it's this interpretation of what can I say, what can I not say. State police are like, we're saying nothing.
Right. Well, and keep in mind that the purpose of a gag order is because you don't want to, you know, be influencing potential jurors when you have a jury pool and you don't know who's going to be sitting on it. It's to be, you know, preventing word from getting to a jury about, you know, what that might influence them one way or another. I'll be honest. Right now, the sentencing is completely in the hands of Judge Gall. And if there's one thing that we know about Judge Gall, she's not easily influenced by public opinion at all. So I'll be honest, I am surprised at this point that the gag order would continue, because for the families after all these years to be able to have the right to finally say something, I mean, I can understand in some ways. There's going to be a time and a place and a day for law enforcement and the investigators, but you know, to prevent the prosecutors to prevent the defense attorneys, I don't see the point of continuing this gag order at this point.
I mean, and they've commented on social media before at different times, kind of esoterically, nothing right out. But so you have to, I mean, and we've been here kind of on lockdown the whole time. I haven't checked social media lately to see what's been tweeted about by, you know, Kelsey, Libby's older sister, has tweeted over the years. Becky Patty has put things on Facebook over the years. Nothing, you know, not very long statements or anything like that. Nothing that some would say would violate the gag order. But yeah, I don't know.
I would imagine, like you both pointed out, there will be some acknowledgement of what happened today by the families, at least on social media. But, you know, with the gag order in place, if Judge Gall says folks aren't supposed to be saying things, up to this point, everyone has been very tight-lipped as far as, you know, really sharing information related to the case.
And as journalists, as reporters, you're in this position where you don't want to put anyone in a bad position to come up to them and ask them to talk. You want to
respect the
process.
process.
You want to respect the process. You want to be a responsible journalist. You don't want to insert yourself and be in someone's face when they're trying to obey a gag order.
Yeah, you don't want to be asking them to violate a court order that's in place.
That's right.
So, yeah, we would love to be able. You have to imagine all the emotions that these families and that these attorneys keep in mind. The prosecution team, how hard they've been working on this case for years now. The defense team, who believes in their hearts that Richard Allen is not guilty of these crimes. You know that they would love to be able to share what they're thinking, but they just can't right now.
It's difficult. Sam's been going around the courthouse here, seeing people who felt like they did have something that they wanted to share, and she joins us now. Sam.
Well, Emily had just mentioned a second ago about checking social media because so many of the family members had been pretty active and vocal on social media. I did want to share with you Kelsey German, of course, the sister of Libby German. She hasn't shared her own words quite yet, but she did repost on X, formerly known as Twitter, and she shared a pretty lengthy post, but I want to read you just part of it. It says, guilty verdicts are a strange thing. It goes on to hear, it says, you hear the word guilty and a bunch of different emotions hit you. Relief, yes, but also sadness. And at the end, it shares a quote saying, when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous and terror to the evildoers. Today, rejoice that justice has come to the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. Again, Kelsey German, Libby's sister, resharing that post on social media. We do expect, despite the gag order, like we mentioned, some family members have shared basic thoughts, things they're allowed to share on social media. We certainly expect more of that could come in the days to come. Guys.
Thank you, Sam, for looking that up. I really appreciate hearing that context. As we've been here, we haven't been able to be scrolling on social media, but boy, that whole post that Kelsey put up just shows how deep, how painful this whole process is.
And you know, she was the last person to see those girls alive. She is the one, Libby's older sister, that dropped them off at the Mears entrance that day, and she said her sister turned around and said, I love you, and those were the last words that she heard her sister say to her on that day, on that afternoon.
And again, that post just reiterates the fact that, you know, there are certain folks who will say this is a day for celebration. You know, it's a hard day, even for those who were hoping that the jury would come through with the verdict that they announced today. It's a hard day.
It's a tough day, and it's not over, as the sentencing is now set for December 20th. That gag order staying in place until that time, per the judge's orders. That's the latest here from Delphi. For Sam and Emily and Bob, I'm Anne Marie, sending it back to you, Scott.
All right, Ann, thanks so much for your coverage and that of Bob and Emily. They have been in court every day, and because cameras were not allowed, they have been bringing us comprehensive coverage every day here on Channel 13 and, of course, every night at 10 on Delphi Debrief. Thank you so much. Our team coverage will continue today at 4 o'clock. Dustin Grove and Felicia Lawrence will be along with you, and we'll see you throughout the evening here on Channel 13 with more coverage from Delphi on a day where Richard Allen has been found guilty of murdering 2 young girls. And those 2 girls are who we remember today, Libby German and Abby Williams. We'll see you back at 4.